Well, you wanted to know about, I've never fired a gun on a set. I fired blanks. And there's a scene in the film, you may remember it. Jason Miller playing Father Karras is alone in his room listening to a tape recording, and suddenly the phone rings, and he turns into a close-up, terrified. Well, he knew, because he read the script, that what was going to make him turn was the sound of a telephone ringing. Well, you know, that certainly wasn't going to give him the look or the feeling of fright that he needed. So what I did off camera was, at the precise moment when he least expected it, I would fire off a blank, a gun which has a very loud report, a 38 policeman special. And often I used a 45. And I fired this off, and of course it would produce the same response in almost anyone here, whether you're familiar with guns or not. And that isn't something I invented. I had read that in an old issue of Life magazine in an article about the great director George Stevens, who directed, among other films...
Giant.
What?
Giant! Yes, that's Giant.
So, among other films, he directed Giant. And he also directed a film called The Diary of Anne Frank, which, as many of you know, is about a Jewish family hiding in an attic in Amsterdam when the Nazis have invaded. And every time they hear the sirens out in the street, they're terrified. And they shot the movie on a set, not in an attic in Amsterdam with the Nazis in the street. And so George Stevens, I read, sat above the set, and he had a rifle that he used to fire off whenever the sirens were supposed to go off. And of course, those actors playing the Frank family were terrified. And I remembered that, and I filed it away, and I've used it in any number of films to produce a terrified response like that. For example, if I'm shooting Chris here, you know, and he has to react in some way, there's a camera right here. He's not looking at a demon. He's not seeing anything that's frightening him. Right behind this camera is a crew, a lot of guys standing around scratching their backs, a lot of people reading the newspaper, you know, having a cup of coffee. That's all over there, not what I cut to when I go to the other side. So I've got to get a mood going that will provoke him into the correct response. Because the actors are not working in a real situation, except like in the chase scenes I've done. Those are all real. But to get an actor to be terrified or really frightened or even to get their concentration, you have to provoke that. Because what they're seeing, where the so-called fourth wall is behind the camera, is not what they're supposed to be seeing in the film. So, weird things that happen on the set, like what?
Just, you know, there's always been urban legends of weird paranormal things happening. And, you know.
I've never contributed to the urban legends.
Yeah.
I know, I've read a lot of them, you know. There has probably been more garbage written about The Exorcist than anything I know about. I never read that in, let's say, Bridesmaids, there were paranormal occurrences on the set. Have you, Chris?
You never know.
No, but I never read that. But you read that constantly about The Exorcist. Yeah, I never read that, you know, like in whatever it is.
3 Men and a Baby.
What?
Wasn't there some in 3 Men and a Baby?
In 3 Men and a Baby? Yeah, I think that was filled with paranormal activity. I know there's all these stories. Yeah, Mark, what is it?
Oh, sorry.
You raised your hand.
I didn't think you were.
Boy, you just trying to stretch or what?
I didn't think you were done with your point.
Huh?
I didn't think you were done with your point, but I wanted to ask you about working with Dick Smith and a lot of the prosthetic effects and things that you had on set, and what were some of the more complex ones? And because you guys didn't have the benefit of CGI or anything back then, it was all real. So.
We had to do everything. Mark's question is how I worked with Dick Smith, the makeup artist. And the first, Dick Smith is a genius. He's really brilliant. He did Brando's makeup in The Godfather. He did Little Big Man. Just so many great makeup. Amadeus, for which he won his first Academy Award. But when we started out, we had the same problem with the demon makeup as we had with the voice. What is that supposed to look like? And Dick showed me some drawings he had made of horrific images, you know, really disturbing images, and I rejected them because I felt that they weren't organic. In other words, they didn't show Linda Blair's own features. They were just like horror mask faces. And I rejected them. And he said, well, tell me what you want then. Tell me which way you think we ought to go. And so, again, when you put your mind to something, often you'll get an inspiration. And I remember thinking, look, I want this makeup to seem organic, like she did it to herself. There's a scene in the film where she masturbates with a crucifix. And I thought, it's a metallic crucifix. And I thought, possibly, probably, she scarred her own face with that metallic crucifix. Or the demon has done that to her. And the makeup or the sores could be an outgrowth of that, like gangrenous sores from scarring yourself. Or what burn victims look like after, you know, serious burns and the gangrene sets in. And that got Dick excited. And he went out and found some pictures of gangrenous wounds and people whose faces had been badly scarred, and we based her makeup on that. And that's what I mean by organic. You know, it wasn't just some monster makeup like pretty much what you see in films today. Guy comes out with vampire teeth or whatever, zombie. You know. Of course, you can see that on Mockingbird Lane almost every time of day, right? But what else? Yes, sir.
How do you get Linda Blair down them stairs?
Oh, the backward shot down the stairs? That was a contortionist named Linda Hager. And she was able to walk backward down the stairs. And she was about Linda Blair's size. As far as I know, she was the only person around who could do that then, and I don't know too many others around today. Yes, ma'am. Well, the question was, how did I think the film would be received with all of this stuff happening to a 12-year-old girl? And what's your name? Vicky said when she first saw the film, when it came out, she thought, oh my God, when she saw that what was going on with a 12-year-old girl, and she's old school, and she was very disturbed. I was much more disturbed about how this would affect her. We auditioned a couple of thousand young girls. I thought it was never going to be possible to do this with a 12-year-old girl. And we started auditioning 16, 15-year-old young women to do this, and they were all disturbed by the experience of even talking about it. And then one day, after literally over 2,000 auditions, and I thought, we can never make this film. It will either there's no young girl that can do this, or they're going to get too upset from the experience. One day I was in my office at Warner Brothers in New York at 666 Fifth Avenue. And that's where it was. That's where we planned the film and edited it. And that used to be their headquarters. Somebody's gotten wise since, Chris, and they don't have that number anymore. But one day at my office, my secretary buzzed me and she said, there's a woman out here named Eleanor Blair, and she's brought her 12-year-old daughter with her, doesn't have an appointment. Would you see her? And I thought, yeah, why not? And so she came in, and the instant I saw Linda, I knew that she was the one. The instant I saw her. But she sat down, and her mother sat right next to her. And I said, so Linda, do you know anything about The Exorcist? She said, yeah, I read it. I said, you read it? She said, yeah. And I looked at her mother nodded. And she said, I said, well, what's The Exorcist about? And she said, it's about a little girl that gets possessed by a devil, and then she does a whole bunch of bad things. And I said, well, like, what sort of bad things? And she said, well, she hits her mother across the face, and she pushes a man out of her bedroom window, and she masturbates with a crucifix. And I looked at her mother, and her mother, yeah. And I said, do you know what that means, Linda? She said, what? I said, to masturbate. And she said, it's like jerking off, isn't it? And I looked over at her mother, and lovely woman, and I looked at her mother, and then I said, have you ever done that, Linda? And she said, sure, haven't you? And that was it. She was the only one I could talk to like that. And then on the set, you'll see some of these pictures if you get a hold of my book. But on the set, you see me talking with her, and I became like a surrogate father to her. I would talk to her about, she didn't know fully the meaning of what she was doing, and I didn't explain it to her. But I would tell her, look, you have to do this now, and I would say, and then you have to say this line of dialogue. And she'd say, oh, no. She said, I can't say that. And I said, oh, yes, you can. She said, no, I can't. And I would say, if you don't do that, Linda, no milkshake today. And I'd say, oh, please. You know, she was a typical, normal 12-year-old girl. She's now 52 years old. She's very active still in theater, television, and with PETA, you know, the Animal Protection Society. And she's very well-adjusted and lovely young woman, and, you know, we're still very good friends. But she was able to deal with it, and I didn't find anyone else who could.
She survived the experience.
Hopefully. Yeah, this guy.
Yes.
One thing that's always intrigued me about The Exorcist has to do with the whole Sumerian Babylonian connection and Pazuzu and the possession and kind of the thread that runs all the way through to Georgetown from Iraq.
What's the question? Remember Larry King? What's the question? Chicago, Illinois. What's the question for Billy Friedkin? You ever hear that guy? You know what he used to do? I was on his radio show, and he'd be sitting there with a phone. The show was on live from midnight to 3 a.m. from Roslyn, Virginia. And this guy would sit there and he'd say, so, Billy Friedkin's here, director of The Exorcist. We'll take some phone calls. Okay, Chicago, Illinois. What's the question for Billy Friedkin? And then he'd go. And while I'm talking to the guy on the speaker phone, he's grabbing a knot off, you know? And he knew when to wake up. He knew when I was like done, and he'd say, Dallas, Texas, what's the question for Billy Friedkin? Like, well, the demon is an Abyssinian demon. It's a real demon from that area, Mesopotamia, where we shot the film. Northern Iraq. All of Iraq was part of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and the Euphrates River meet in southern Iraq. We were in the north, in Mosul, which is Kurdish territory. The demon was from about 300 BC. That is a replica of the actual demon Pazuzu, an Abyssinian demon. The original is in the British Museum now. And so we had to make one in Burbank, California, and ship it to Mosul, Iraq. But yes, all that stuff is in the film to give you a sense of the disturbing mythology around the concept of demonic possession and evil spirits and stuff. And while I was in Iraq, I actually met and spent some time with the sheikh of the Yazidi tribe, which is a Muslim sect. The Yazidis are the devil worshippers, so they're sort of kept in the closet by the Muslim faith. But I met with the head of the Yazidis, and we had a long conversation. I was warned when I decided to go that the area would be surrounded by flies, and you could not kill a fly because the Yazidi believed that the devil was in flies and serpents. And basically, their basic belief was that God ruled, you know, in the heavens, but the devil rules on earth. And the devil is the one they were afraid of. And so I was warned never to swat a fly. When I went to the sheikh's tent, he was sitting outside of his tent, cross-legged, covered in flies. The flies were everywhere in this little encampment. And immediately they were all over me. And I was dressed in Arabic gear, covered from head to toe with a veil across my mouth. And still these flies were all over me, and I had to just politely go like this or that. I could never swat one, or I wouldn't have been here tonight. And I put my hand on the back of my neck and see it was covered with blood. And but he spoke to me about the beliefs of his tribe, and it was very enlightening, very interesting. And he had asked to meet with me because he had heard that these crazy Americans had come to Mosul and put up a statue to the demon Pazuzu, and we were bringing raw meat sacrifices to it, which we did to attract vultures and stuff and to get the wild dogs going. And he heard that, so he said, I guess in his own way, he said, I'd like to meet those guys. And he was very disappointed when I told him that I didn't share his beliefs. I was doing it for a movie. But since he had never seen a movie, he wasn't all that disturbed.
We have time for one more question, and then the book signing will commence. This lady up here. Yes, you.
Was Jason Miller your first choice for Father Karras?
The question was Jason Miller my first choice for Father Karras? Absolutely not. There were many actors who wanted to play that part. Paul Newman, Jack Nicholson. I remember Jack Nicholson coming to see me in a restaurant where I was having lunch with Ellen Burstyn after I'd cast her, and he had worked with her. And he said, come on, man, you're not going to consider me for this? I said, Jack, if I show you in a priest collar, the whole audience is going to go up. You know, you're not going to be accepted in a priest collar. And I was really looking for a priest. And what the hell was that? You feel something in the room? So, while I was in New York, a play had just opened called That Championship Season. And it was about a college or a high school coach of basketball and his starting five. And they had won a state championship 20 years ago. And it turns out in the course of this play that they had cheated to win the high school championship game, that their lives were a fraud, their victory was a fraud, and the movie had the play had a strong air of lapsed Catholicism. And so I remember saying to my casting director, who's the guy who wrote this? I'd like to talk to him. And it turned out that Jason Miller, who wrote the play, had studied for the priesthood. He went to Catholic University in Washington for 3 years, studied for the priesthood, had a crisis of faith, and dropped out. But I said, I still like to talk to him. So I met with him, and I wasn't that much impressed initially, and we signed another actor. Jason had never really, he'd never played the lead anywhere. He played smaller parts in road companies of plays, on the road somewhere. And he was actually working full-time until this play hit, his first produced play. He was working as a milkman in Flushing, New York. And we cast somebody else. We cast an actor who was very good actor at that time, 30 years old. He had done Shakespeare on Broadway and Eugene O'Neill. His name is Stacy Keach. And we cast him. And then I met Jason Miller, who was not an actor, really. He was a milkman and a new playwright. And but he was the guy. And I just felt, ladies and gentlemen, that the movie God was taking care of us. I really felt that. From the time that I was asked to direct the film, there was no reason. I did not have a body of work that indicated I could make a film like The Exorcist. But somehow or other I had been chosen to do it. The whole cast, like Linda Blair, was handed to me on a silver platter. Jason Miller, and I just went with the flow. And I believed and believed strongly in God. In fact, I personally don't mean to offend anyone, but I believe in the teachings of Jesus. I don't see a great similarity between, the man who walked around the desert in a robe and sandals and preached on hillsides and at seasides and on boats. I don't see a great example of that in the Catholic Church today, with the fancy robes and the Vatican and the Sistine Chapel, and they own banks, and so I don't quite make the connection, but I still read the New Testament. I believe in the teachings of Jesus and Buddha, and yes, Mohammed, what I know of them, and God knows that's about it. But how can you? Part of what allowed me to make The Exorcist was that openness to believe that anything was possible. It's like in the play Hamlet, when Hamlet says to his friend Horatio, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio." That's sort of how I look at my own life. There are just so many things that are beyond my understanding or control. And like all of us, we're all creatures of fate as well as faith. We have nothing to say about how we're going to get born, or if we're going to ever be born, or to who or where. And we have very little, if anything, to say about how we're going to die. We are, in my view, the way I would describe it, in God's hands. Now that means something different to all of you. I'm not talking about some guy resting on a cloud with a long white beard. I have no idea of how to conceptualize that, except The Exorcist, to me, has always been about the mystery of faith. The mystery of faith. Why do people, after over 2,000 years and more, believe in things they've never seen, never heard? Jesus never wrote anything that we know of. There are no books or pamphlets or anything. They all come from others. And yet trillions of people all over the world believe in these and other mysteries. And that's part of what keeps us going. And I was open to that, to answer your question, when I directed The Exorcist.
Ladies and gentlemen, William Friedkin.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you. very much.